what folktale or urban myth turned out to actually be true. At my college in Texas, there was this creepy story everyone talked about. It was about a student who got lost in some secret tunnels under the school and died there. Most of us thought it was just made up, like one of those spooky stories people tell to scare each other. I mean, there were all these ghost stories tied to it. People said they heard weird noises coming from underground or saw strange shadows in the basements. It all seemed too wild to be true. But then, in my last year of college, something weird happened. I got a part-time job working for the school, and that's when I found out the truth. Those tunnels, they were real, and they were huge. It turns out there's this whole maze of tunnels running under the entire college. They're not for secret meetings or hiding treasure or anything cool like that. Nope, they're for something much more boring. They carry steam to heat up all the buildings on campus. But here's the crazy part, the story about the student dying down there. That was real too. It happened a long time ago, but the school hadn't forgotten. They made this big rule that no one was ever allowed to go into the tunnels alone. You always had to have a buddy with you. They didn't want anyone else getting lost and, well, it was pretty freaky to learn that this urban legend I'd heard for years was actually true. I mean, I'd walked over those tunnels every day, never knowing what was really down there or what had happened. Sometimes I wonder about that student. Did they know how big the tunnels were when they went in? Did they get scared when they realized they were lost? Anyway, it just goes to show you, sometimes those crazy stories you hear might have some truth to them. Makes you think twice about all those other campus legends, doesn't it? Before I read story 2, I want to ask you to please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps a lot with the algorithm and will help us to continue growing and providing you stories like the one you're listening to now. Thanks. Story 2. In my hometown, there was this weird little house that everyone talked about. It sat just outside of town in a big field. You could see it from the main road, but it was far enough away to look spooky and mysterious. Of course, all us kids thought it was haunted. That's what you do with creepy old houses, right? Make up stories about ghosts and stuff. The story we all knew was about a banshee. If you don't know, a banshee is like a ghost lady who screams really loud. People said if you went by the house late at night, you could hear this awful shrieking sound. It would send chills down your spine just thinking about it. We'd dare each other to go near the house after dark. Some kids said they heard the screams. Others were too scared to get close. It became this big thing in our town, the haunted house with a screaming ghost. But then, one day, we found out the truth. And let me tell you, it was way weirder than any ghost story. Turns out the people who lived in that house had a pet monkey, a real live monkey in our boring little town. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't exactly legal to have a monkey as a pet in our state, so these people had to keep it a big secret. They probably thought putting their house way out on the edge of town would help hide it. But monkeys, well, they make some pretty weird noises, especially at night. And that screaming sound we all thought was a ghost. Yep, you guessed it, just a monkey doing monkey things. It was kind of disappointing to find out it wasn't really haunted, but also pretty cool to know there had been a secret monkey living in our town all that time. Sometimes I wonder if those people knew about all the stories we made up about their house. Did they laugh about it? Or were they worried we'd figure out their secret? Story 3. There's this weird house in my friend's neighborhood. It's across a small lake up on a hill. My buddy always joked about the lights in this haunted house, but no one ever took him seriously. One night, I was at his place working on a school project. He suddenly said, "The lights are going again." I looked out the window and saw the house all lit up. I was confused because my friend told me there had been a big fire there 5 years ago. The whole family inside died, and the house was left empty and broken. It shouldn't have any power. We argued about it for a while but couldn't figure it out. So one Saturday night, a bunch of us decided to check it out. We'd had a few drinks, which probably wasn't the smartest idea. The drive to the house was long and twisty. Tall grass grew everywhere. It was creepy. Halfway there, we saw something that scared us all, a big, mean-looking wolf standing in the road. It didn't want to move. We had to rev the engine and flash the lights to make it go away. When we got to the house, it looked awful. The door was hanging off its hinges, so we just pushed it open and went inside. It was super creepy knowing people had died there. We looked around for a bit, then remembered why we came to check if there was power. We found a light switch that looked okay and flipped it. Nothing happened, but then we all felt something weird. It was like a cold wave of fear and anger washed over us. We all knew we shouldn't be there. Without saying anything, we left as fast as we could. We never really talked about it after that. It was too strange. I almost forgot about the whole thing until I visited my friend's parents' house a few months ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. The lights in that creepy old house were on again. I'm not usually into ghost stories or anything like that, but I swear there was something in that house, and whatever it was, it didn't want us there. Story 4. So, I live in this big city called Lima. It's in Peru, way down in South America. Lima's a pretty wild place, but even for Lima, this story is pretty weird. People started talking about this clown, right? But not just any clown. This one was special. They said he only showed up at night really late. Like, middle of the night late. Around 3 in the morning to be exact. Now most people hearing this would think, no way. That's crazy talk. I mean, a clown in the middle of the night? Come on. But in Lima, you learn to expect the unexpected. So one night, I decided to check it out for myself. I stayed up super late and went to this intersection where people said the clown shows up. I felt kind of silly sitting there in my car at 3 in the morning waiting for a clown. But then, it happened. Right there, in the glow of the street lights, this clown just appears, like magic. He's got this
right there in the street,
big red nose, crazy hair, the whole deal. And
this
he starts
clown,
juggling.
this middle of the night clown was real. He was juggling balls and everything, like it was the most normal thing in the world to be clowning around at 3 a.m. But wait, it gets weirder. He starts handing out balloons. To who? I don't know. Maybe to the few cars passing by or to imaginary kids. Who knows? But there he is, juggling and giving out balloons in the dead of night. I've seen him a few times since then. Always at the same time, always at that intersection. I don't know who he is or why he does it. Maybe he works a regular job during the day and this is his way of following his clown dreams. Or maybe he's just trying to make the night a little less scary for people. Whatever the reason, he's there. The 3 a.m. clown of Lima. It's one of those things that makes you realize the world is a pretty strange and amazing place. And sometimes the craziest stories turn out to be true. Just don't ask me to explain it. Some things in life you just have to accept. Story 5. Have you ever heard of a rogue wave? It's like a giant wall of water that comes out of nowhere in the middle of the ocean. For hundreds of years, sailors told stories about these massive waves. They said these waves could be as tall as a 10-story building. But here's the funny thing. Nobody believed them. People thought sailors were just making up wild stories to sound cool when they got back to land. You know how fishermen sometimes exaggerate about the size of the fish they caught? Well, people thought this was kind of like that. As time went on, scientists started studying the ocean more seriously. They had fancy equipment and everything. But they couldn't find any proof of these giant waves. Sometimes a scientist would say they saw one, but without hard evidence, it was just another story. Then, in the 1980s, something interesting happened. Oil companies found a big gas field in the North Sea. They built a special platform there to get the gas out. This platform was different from others because it had all sorts of sensors on it. One of these sensors measured how big the waves were. For years, nothing unusual happened. But then on New Year's Day in 1995, something amazing happened. The sensors recorded a massive wave hitting the platform. This wave was about 80 feet high. That's as tall as an 8-story building. Suddenly, all those old sailor stories didn't seem so crazy anymore. Scientists finally had proof that rogue waves were real. It wasn't just tall tales or people seeing things. These giant waves really do exist out there in the ocean. This discovery changed how we think about the ocean. It made people realize that even with all our technology and knowledge, the sea still has some big surprises for us. It also made people take those old sailor stories more seriously. Maybe those sailors weren't just trying to impress people in pubs after all. Now, scientists are trying to figure out how and why these rogue waves happen.
Story 6. In my hometown, there was this strange old guy everyone knew about. We called him the Squirrel Man, or sometimes Aqualung, after some old rock song. He was a real mystery to us kids. You'd always see him in the parks, wearing the same black and red checkered jacket. But here's the weird part. He was always surrounded by squirrels. I mean, not just one or two, but loads of them. They'd be climbing all over him, sitting on his shoulders, eating from his hands. It was like he was some kind of squirrel magnet. The Squirrel Man never really talked to people. He'd just sit there, quiet as can be, with all his furry friends. Us kids, we made up all sorts of stories about him. The craziest one was that he could actually talk to the squirrels. We thought maybe he was like a real-life Dr. Dolittle or something. Some of the older kids said he was always like that because he was on a perma trip. We didn't really know what that meant, but it sounded cool and mysterious. Years later, when I was grown up, I asked my dad about the Squirrel Man. Turns out, my dad knew him way back when, before he became the weird squirrel guy. The story my dad told me was pretty wild. He said one night, the Squirrel Man fell asleep on a park bench. In his pocket, he had a few tabs of acid. If you don't know, acid is a hallucinogenic drug that messes with your brain. Anyway, it rained that night, and the rain soaked through his clothes and the acid got into his skin. After that night, the guy was never the same. It was like his brain got stuck in a weird place, and he couldn't find his way back. That's how he ended up becoming the Squirrel Man. It's a pretty sad story when you think about it. One rainy night changed his whole life. But you know what? Even though we now know why he was so strange, we still don't know if he could really talk to squirrels. I mean, they sure seemed to like him a lot. Maybe in his own way, he did learn to communicate with them. Story 7. In a small town in Pennsylvania, there was this creepy story everyone knew. People talked about a green man who roamed the streets at night. Kids would dare each other to stay out late, hoping to catch a glimpse of this mysterious figure. Some folks said he glowed in the dark. Others swore he had no face. The stories got wilder and wilder, like a game of telephone where each person adds a little more to make it scarier. For years, the Green Man was just a spooky tale to tell around campfires or to scare your little brother. But then people started to realize the truth, and let me tell you, the real story was way sadder than any ghost story. Turns out, there really was a man walking around at night. But he wasn't green, and he definitely wasn't a monster. He was just a regular guy who'd had a really tough break in life. See, this man had been in a terrible accident. It left his face badly different from everyone else, disfigured, and that made him really self-conscious. During the day, he stayed inside because he was afraid of scaring people or making them uncomfortable. But at night, when the streets were empty, he'd go out for walks. It was the only time he felt free to move around without worrying about how others would react. The green color? That was just the weird glow from the streetlights bouncing off his skin. And the no-face part? Well, that was probably because it was too dark to see his features clearly. When people found out the truth, it hit them hard. This wasn't some creepy monster. It was just a lonely guy trying to live his life the best he could. I always feel a mix of emotions when I think about this story. On one hand, it's cool to find out the truth behind an urban legend. But on the other hand, it's really sad to think about how lonely and isolated that man must have felt. Story 8. In my town, we had this scary story about a monster called the Beast from the East. It wasn't just some made-up tale. Weird stuff was really happening. A kid went missing. Pets disappeared. Someone even found a deer all torn up on the old train tracks. And get this, those tracks weren't even used anymore, so it couldn't have been hit by a train. We all got pretty freaked out. Parents told their kids to stay close to home. People kept their pets inside or behind big fences. Now our town's got woods all around it. We knew there were some wild animals out there, coyotes, lynx, maybe even wolverines. Most grown-ups thought these animals were just coming into town to hunt. See, every fall and spring deer would come into town, and the wild animals probably followed them. But us kids? We were sure it was something way scarier. We imagined this huge, hungry monster prowling around at night, looking for pets and maybe even children to eat. This went on for years.
Then one day, this trapper decided to set up some traps. He was hoping to catch whatever was causing all the trouble. Plus, he could sell the fur and make some money. What he caught shocked everyone. It was a mountain lion. Now that might not sound too weird, but trust me, it was. Mountain lions aren't supposed to be anywhere near our part of Canada. The experts say they're extinct on the east side of the country. We're pretty far east, only a couple 100 miles from Manitoba. Suddenly, all those stories about the beast from the east made sense. It wasn't some made-up monster. It was a real live mountain lion. The funny thing is, for years, the police and forest rangers kept telling us there was nothing to worry about. They said there weren't any dangerous animals around. Turns out, we kids were right all along. There really was a monster living near our town. It's pretty wild to think about.
This big cat was out there the whole time, sneaking around, while everyone thought we were just telling scary stories. It makes you wonder what other secrets might be hiding in the woods around town. Story 9. So, there was this weird story going around the UK about a guy called Purple Aki. Now, I know that sounds like a made-up name, but stick with me. The story went like this. Purple Aki was supposed to be this huge, muscular guy who wandered around Liverpool. But here's the strange part. People said he'd go up to young guys and ask to squeeze their muscles. And if that wasn't weird enough, he'd then ask if he could pick them up and do squats with them, like they were human dumbbells or something. When I first heard about Purple Aki, I was a teenager living in London. I thought it was just some crazy story the kids in Liverpool made up. You know how it is. Every city has its own weird tales. I laughed it off, thinking those Liverpool kids must have wild imaginations. But then something happened that made it not so funny anymore. One day the news was full of stories about Purple Aki. But it wasn't because someone finally caught him on camera or anything like that. No, it was much worse. A teenage boy had died trying to get away from him. The poor kid was so scared he ran onto some train tracks and got hit by a train. It was awful. Suddenly, Purple Aki wasn't just some silly story anymore. He was real, and the things he did were causing serious harm. The police got involved, and Purple Aki's face was all over the news. It was pretty shocking to realize that this urban legend, this story I thought was too bizarre to be true, was actually real. There really was a guy going around asking to squeeze people's muscles. And now, because of him, a young person had lost their life. Story 10. In Wyckoff, New Jersey, we had this spooky story about a guy we called the Wyckoff Wanderer. Everyone said he was this old man who walked around town at night looking for his daughter. The story went that she'd been hit by a fire truck or an ambulance. Nobody could quite remember which. Us kids would tell each other this story to freak each other out. We'd imagine this sad, ghostly figure roaming the dark streets, forever searching for someone he'd lost. It was the kind of tale that made you walk a little faster if you were out after dark. But here's the thing about urban legends. Sometimes they turn out to be kinda true, just not in the way you expect. One night, me and my high school buddies were driving home late. We were laughing and joking around when suddenly we saw him. The Wyckoff Wanderer, right there on the street. Now, in most scary stories, this is where you'd speed up and get out of there, right? But we were curious teenagers, so instead, we pulled over and decided to talk to him. Turns out, the Wyckoff Wanderer wasn't some creepy ghost or anything. He was just a regular guy with an unusual problem. He told us he had something called light sensitivity. That means bright light hurts his eyes, so he only goes out for walks at night when it's dark. We didn't ask about his daughter or anything. Maybe we were too surprised to find out he was real, or maybe we just didn't want to bring up something that might be sad. The guy was actually really nice. He even offered me a cigarette, one he'd rolled himself. I took it to be polite even though I don't smoke.
It was just one of those weird, grown-up moments you have as a teenager. What struck me most was how normal and friendly he was. He wasn't some scary monster or a sad ghost. He was just a guy who was probably a bit lonely, out for a nightly walk. It made me think about how we often make up these big, dramatic stories about things we don't understand.
The reality is usually a lot simpler, and sometimes a little sad. Story 11. In West Hobart, Tasmania, there was this house everyone said was haunted. Now, Tasmania is already pretty spooky. It's an island way down at the bottom of Australia. But this house? It was extra creepy. People who lived there would start acting really weird. Not all at once, but slowly, over time. They'd see things that weren't there, hear strange noises, and just generally lose their marbles. It got so bad that folks started saying the house was cursed. Of course, us kids loved this story. We'd dare each other to go near the house or peek in the windows. Some of the braver or crazier ones even talked about spending a night there. But nobody ever did. We were too scared of ending up like the people who lived there. Well, turns out there was something making people crazy in that house. But it wasn't ghosts or demons or anything like that. The real culprit was way weirder. See, in the backyard of this house, there was an old water tank.
You know, one of those big metal things people use to collect rainwater. This one was all overgrown with plants and stuff. Nobody paid much attention to it, but growing right above this tank was a plant called datura. Now, datura is not your average garden flower. It's what grown-ups call a deliriant. That means it can make you see and hear things that aren't real if you eat it or breathe it in. Here's what was happening. The datura plant would drop its flowers onto the water tank. The flowers would mix with the water, and the people in the house would drink this water or use it for cooking. They were basically taking tiny doses of this mind-bending plant every day without knowing it. It's pretty wild when you think about it. All these people thought they were going crazy or being haunted, but really, they were just accidentally drugging themselves with flower water. When this all came out, people were shocked. It was like finding out your scary monster was just a shadow on the wall.
Some folks were relieved it wasn't really haunted, while others were kind of disappointed. I mean, a weird plant is cool and all, but it's not as exciting as a real haunted house, right? Story 12. So, my friend told me this wild story about his hometown. It's one of those small places where everyone knows everyone and nothing exciting ever happens. Well, almost nothing. There was this house in town that people said was haunted. Now, we're not talking full-on ghost sightings or anything. It was more like weird stuff. The people living there would hear strange noises at night. Sometimes they'd wake up and find windows open that they swore they'd closed. And there were these odd smells that no one could figure out. At first, the family living there tried to explain it all away. Maybe the window hinges were just loose, they thought. And those scratching sounds in the walls? Probably just rats or mice. No big deal, right? Wrong. So wrong. One day, and I don't know exactly how this went down, they found out the truth. And let me tell you, it was way creepier than any ghost story. Turns out there was someone living in their attic. A real, live person. This guy had somehow gotten into the house and made himself a little home up there without anyone knowing. But here's where it gets really gross. At night, when everyone was asleep, this attic guy would crawl out of his hiding spot. He'd go outside and catch small animals, squirrels, raccoons, that kind of thing. Then he'd bring them back up to the attic and eat them raw. Can you imagine? All those strange noises? That was this guy moving around the open windows. That was him coming and going. And those weird smells? Well, I think you can guess what that was about. When the family found out, they freaked out. I mean, wouldn't you? They'd been living with this secret roommate for who knows how long. It must have felt like something out of a horror movie. The weirdest part is, my friend says the family didn't stick around town much longer after that. I guess once you find out someone's been living in your attic and eating raw raccoons, you kind of want a fresh start somewhere else. Story 13. In my hometown, there's this old house with a pretty wild history. People say it used to be a hideout for Al Capone, one of the most famous gangsters ever. Can you imagine a real mobster hanging out in our little town? Our town sits next to a big river, and years after the mobsters left, someone found something super cool. There was a secret tunnel under the house that went all the way to the river. Everyone figured it was an escape route in case the police showed up and the bad guys needed to make a quick getaway. This discovery got all us kids thinking, if there was one secret tunnel, maybe there were more. We started wondering if there could be tunnels under our high school. We imagined hidden entrances inside the school building and secret exits just off school grounds. How awesome would that be? When we asked our teachers about it, they just laughed it off. They said we were being silly and there was no way there were tunnels under the school. Most grown-ups treated it like a big joke. But then, we found one. I'm not kidding. There really was a secret tunnel under our school. The entrance was in the weirdest place, under the stage in the auditorium, hidden behind a wall in the orchestra pit. It was like something out of a spy movie. I only went in a little bit. It was dark and kind of scary, to be honest. But some of the braver or crazier kids went in deeper. They said they walked for ages, probably all the way across the school grounds. At the end, they found a locked door. They couldn't see what was beyond it, but they think the tunnel might go even further. Even after we found this tunnel, our teachers still said there weren't any others. But now we knew they'd been wrong once. Who knows? Maybe there are more secret passages hidden around our school. Story 14. There was this weird guy who lived in an apartment building near my house. Everyone talked about him like he was some kind of monster from a scary story. People said he'd pretend there was an emergency so an ambulance would come. Then he'd dress up like a paramedic to try and get kids to come inside his apartment. I didn't believe it at first. No way someone would actually do that, right? But then something happened to me when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I was walking by the apartment building with my friends. We saw an ambulance parked outside. A man was leaning out of a window smoking a cigarette. I asked him what was going on. He said he was a paramedic taking a break. He told us an old lady had died in one of the apartments. Then he asked us to come upstairs. My heart started racing. Without thinking, my friends and I ran as fast as we could to my house. We were so scared. I'm 14 now, but that memory still gives me the creeps. I see that guy around sometimes. People say he only went after little kids. I'm not the only one who remembers this. 4 of my friends were there too. If you're from the Hartcliffe area in Bristol, you might have heard about this guy. People called him the Laughing Man. I don't know if that's his real name, but thinking about his laugh still scares me. Story 15. In my middle school, everyone whispered about a secret underground area. Kids said it was full of ghosts because some students had been trapped down there and died in a hidden swimming pool. We all thought it was just a scary story to freak out the younger kids. One day my friend found a weird door in a quiet hallway where nobody ever went. He figured out how to unlock it and we decided to skip gym class and check it out. We only had one tiny flashlight, but we were too curious to turn back. As we crept down the dark stairs, our hearts were pounding. We couldn't see much, just shadows and dusty shapes. Suddenly we bumped into something cold and wet. A rusty water fountain started spraying water everywhere. We almost screamed. Then we saw what looked like ghosts in the darkness. It turned out to be a huge mirror on the wall, but for a second, we were ready to run for our lives. The scariest part was these big cages made of chain link fences. They had padlocks on the gates. Most of them just held old gym stuff, but we couldn't help thinking about how easy it would be to lock someone inside. At the end of a long hallway, we found it, the swimming pool from the stories. It was empty and bone dry. There were no fences or rails around it. If someone fell in, they'd drop straight to the hard concrete at the bottom. And there was no way to climb back out. That's when we got really scared. We ran back upstairs as fast as we could and never went down there again. Later, we told a teacher about what we'd seen. He just laughed it off, saying there was no pool or basement under the school. But we knew the truth. We'd been there. After that day, the door to that quiet hallway was always locked. Sometimes I wonder if they're trying to keep us out or keep something else in. Story 16. In a small Italian village, a little girl often heard her dad tell scary bedtime stories. He'd warn her about spies who sneaked into town during World War II. These spies, he said, would grab naughty girls who didn't go to sleep. The girl thought it was just make-believe to get her to behave. Years later, when she grew up, she learned something shocking. Her dad's story wasn't just pretend, it had roots in real events. During the war, strangers really did come to their village. They took a young girl and killed her by the river. People said she was the daughter of an important man in politics. She was staying in the village with her grandma and mom, thinking it was safer there. Nobody knew who these bad people were or why they did such an awful thing to a little girl. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that haunted the village for years. The grown-up woman couldn't believe that her dad's spooky tale had some truth to it. It made her wonder what other secrets her quiet hometown might be hiding. Story 17. Imagine finding a real dead body in a spooky funhouse. That's exactly what happened on the set of a TV show called The $6 Million Man. But this wasn't just any body, it had a wild story all its own. The tale starts way back in 1911 with a man named Elmer McCurdy. He was a thief who tried to rob a train in Oklahoma. Things didn't go well for Elmer, and he ended up getting shot and killed. His body was taken to be checked out by a doctor, but nobody came to bury him. The doctor had a weird idea. He decided to keep Elmer's body from rotting and started charging people money to see it. Elmer became a kind of sideshow attraction. His mummified body went on tour around the country. He even showed up in some movies. Then Elmer disappeared. For years, nobody knew where his body went. Fast forward to the 1970s. The TV show crew was working in a funhouse in California, moving what they thought were fake dummies. Suddenly, one of the dummy's arms fell off. The workers were shocked to see real bone inside. They had found Elmer McCurdy after all those years. His body had been painted over and used as a creepy funhouse prop. People couldn't believe it when they heard the news. Finally, Elmer got a proper burial in Guthrie, Oklahoma. But just to make sure he stays put this time, they poured concrete over his grave. No more tours for Elmer. He's resting in peace at last. Story 18th. You know how sometimes you hear a gross story about fast food and think, no way that's true? Well, this one actually happened, and it's pretty yucky. It all went down about 2 years ago in a place called Santa Cruz, Bolivia. There's a fast food joint there named Hot. One day something went really wrong in their kitchen. The guy working the meat grinder had a terrible accident. He got his hand too close to the machine and it chomped off 2 of his fingers. Ouch. They rushed him to the hospital right away. But here's where things got messed up. The next group of workers came in and nobody told them what happened. So they just kept making burgers like normal. Can you see where this is going? Yep, you guessed it. One of those missing fingers ended up in somebody's burger. A customer actually bit into it. Can you imagine how freaked out they must have been? At first, people thought it was just a crazy rumor. I mean, a finger in a burger? Come on. But then the restaurant owners came out and said sorry to everyone. That's when we knew it really happened. This whole finger fiasco shows how one mistake can turn into a big, disgusting problem if people don't talk to each other. It's the kind of story that makes you want to check your food extra carefully before taking a bite. Story 19. Ever heard of the Bunny Man? It's a spooky story that's been floating around my hometown for years. People say he's the ghost of some guy who escaped from a mental hospital and now haunts a bridge nearby. Sounds pretty wild, right? Well, most of it is just made-up stuff to scare kids, but here's the thing. There might be a tiny bit of truth hidden in all that nonsense. The story goes that a long time ago, 2 people got attacked near that bridge. Now, this part isn't some ghost story. It really happened, or at least that's what they say. I haven't dug too deep into it myself. The attacker wasn't your average bad guy. He was swinging an axe, which is scary enough. But what really freaked people out was what he was wearing. The victim said he had on a bunny costume. Weird, huh? But some folks who've looked into it think it might not have been a bunny suit at all. They reckon it was probably the robes worn by a hate group called the Ku Klux Klan. When I told my friend about this, she was always terrified of the Bunnyman story. She said something that really stuck with me. She told me, "I think I'd rather deal with a ghost bunny than real-life racists trying to hurt people." And you know what? I think she's got a point. It's funny how sometimes the made-up stories we tell to scare each other aren't nearly as frightening as the real stuff that happens. This whole bunnyman business made me realize that the monsters in our imagination are often way less scary than the bad things some real people do. Story 20. You know how every school has its own weird stories? Well, my university has a doozy. It's all about this really old chemistry professor who used to run one of the departments. This guy wasn't your average teacher. He was super smart and even invented his own kind of concrete. That's pretty cool, right? But the story gets way stranger. People say that when he died, he had a really odd last wish. He supposedly asked to be buried in the concrete he created. Not in a regular coffin or anything. He wanted to be sealed up in a big block of his special concrete. Now, if you visit our campus, you'll see this weird cube sitting on the steps of a building. The building's named after this professor, by the way. Everyone says his body is inside that cube, still sitting in his wheelchair, frozen in time like some creepy statue. Can you imagine walking past that every day on your way to class? Talk about spooky. But here's the thing. I got curious and asked some of our art history professors about it. They know all about the memorials on campus. Turns out, the part about the professor's body being in there isn't true. Phew, but don't breathe too easy yet. Those same professors said something else that gave me the shivers. They told me that while the body isn't in there, the wheelchair actually is. They put the professor's empty wheelchair right into that concrete cube. So every time I walk by that memorial now, I can't help but think about that empty wheelchair stuck forever in a block of concrete. It's not as creepy as a body would be, but it's still pretty weird. Story 21. You know how sometimes you try to do the right thing, but it totally backfires? Well, that's what happened to me once. It all started when my neighbor told me about this suspicious person hanging around our apartment complex. Being the curious type, I decided to play detective. For 2 whole weeks, I'd walk around the courtyard at the same time every night. I thought I was being clever, you know. Turns out I wasn't as smooth as I thought. One night, the police showed up and arrested me for loitering. Can you believe it? There I was, trying to catch a bad guy, and I ended up in handcuffs instead. Luckily, after I explained what I was up to, they let me go. But get this, I accidentally turned myself into the neighborhood's new urban legend. People probably still talk about the weirdo who kept walking in circles every night. Oops. Speaking of urban legends,
in our city,
that reminds me of a story from my childhood
called the killer clown. Now that's enough to give any kid nightmares, right? This clown wasn't just a story, though. Kids swore they saw him hanging out near our elementary school. There was this big field above the school with soccer areas and a hill on the side. That's where he liked to show up. One day, me and my friends got brave, or maybe just stupid, and decided to check it out ourselves. We climbed up that hill, and there he was, swinging on the swings like it was the most normal thing in the world. A grown man in a clown costume just swinging away. We froze just staring at him. Then it got really scary. He suddenly jumped off the swing and started running towards us. We took off so fast I thought my heart was gonna burst out of my chest. A while later, I remember walking by the play area and seeing a bunch of cop cars parked on this gravel road going up to the field. All us kids figured they must have finally caught the killer clown. Looking back now, I wonder if that clown was just some lonely, misunderstood guy. Or maybe he really was as dangerous as we thought. Either way, it's funny how these local legends can seem so real when you're a kid. Between my accidental loitering and the killer clown, I guess every neighborhood has its share of weird stories. It just goes to show, sometimes the line between being the hero and being the local weirdo is pretty thin. Story 22. When I was a kid, I lived in a place with lots of signs that Native Americans used to live there. There was this one spot that was just so pretty, it took my breath away. I got this idea in my head that it had to be special, maybe even a place where they buried their dead. Being a dramatic kid,
I'd drag my friends out there and make them hold hands in a circle. We'd try to talk to the spirits or whatever. Looking back, it was pretty silly, but hey, kids do weird stuff, right? As I got older, I started feeling super embarrassed about all that ghost talking business. I thought I'd been such a dumb kid, making up stories about sacred grounds and stuff. I tried to forget about it and move on. But then something amazing happened. A few years later, this Native American guy showed up at our house. He starts telling us how special and sacred our land is. Can you believe it? I wasn't so crazy after all. Here's where it gets really wild. This guy asked if his tribe could use our land for something called live out in the desert rituals right near Death Valley. Now, peyote is this plant that makes people see and feel crazy stories everyone talked about. It's super important in some Native American traditions. To be true. We said yes, the first story every was about this poor guy who got lost in the salt flats of Death Valley and spend all night drumming. Getting lost out there is no joke. They're not just sitting around. It's dry. They take this peyote stuff and go on these intense spiritual journeys. But here's the creepy part. He was all mummified. Ground. I know. So there I was. Sounds like something made out of this horror movie, right? About our land being special. The mix of extreme heat and all that salt can dry a body out super fast. Just goes to show. I even talked to one of the park rangers who was there when they found him. He told me something that gave me the shivers. He said when they picked up the body, he could hear the bones rattling inside. Can you imagine? Now the second story is a bit different, but just as weird. You've probably heard of Charles Manson, right? He was this really bad guy who led a cult back in the 1960s. Well, the story goes that his followers used to sell drugs to students at my school. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. The Manson family, as they were called, used to hang around our area. They'd sell drugs to make money for their group. It's pretty wild to think about. These infamous criminals used to walk the same halls as us. Story 24. When I was about 12, my friend and I loved to explore this patch of woods near our homes. Everyone said these woods were super creepy, but that just made them more exciting to us. One day, we decided to build a fort there. We were having a blast, gathering sticks and leaves, feeling like real wilderness survivors. But then something happened that scared us half to death. Out of nowhere, this weird guy appeared behind us. He started yelling at the top of his lungs, telling us to get off his land and never come back. We were frozen with fear. I mean, we knew these woods were public property. No one was supposed to own them. Plus, we'd never had a grown-up yell at us like that before. We took off running faster than we'd ever run before. Our hearts were pounding, and we kept looking over our shoulders to make sure he wasn't chasing us. For weeks after, we were too scared to go back to those woods. Now, here's where it gets really wild. A few years later, we found out who that man really was. Turns out, he wasn't just some grumpy guy who didn't like kids. He was an actual bank robber, and not just any bank robber. This guy had been on the FBI's wanted list for years. Can you believe it? All that time, we thought we were just building a cool fort. But we were actually just a few feet away from where this criminal had hidden all the money he stole. No wonder he freaked out when he saw us there. Looking back, I realized how lucky we were. We could have been in real danger. But at the time, we were just two kids trying to have an adventure in the creepy woods. Story 25. Back in my high school days, we had this weird, creepy thing going on. Our football field wasn't just for games and practice. It was also where we kept finding burned animal bones. I know, gross, right? At first, we all thought it was just some kids trying to freak everyone out. You know how high schoolers can be sometimes, always looking for ways to cause trouble. We figured they were burning bones from dogs and cats they found somewhere just to scare people. But the truth? Oh man, it was way worse than we could have imagined. See, I went to a private Christian school. Turns out there was this group of people who didn't like our school very much. They were into some really dark stuff, occult rituals and all that. And guess where they decided to do their creepy ceremonies? Yep, right on our football field. These people would sneak onto our field at night to do their rituals. They thought they could put some kind of curse on our school. But here's the really awful part. Those weren't just random animal bones we were finding. They were stealing people's pets. Can you imagine how heartbroken those families must have been? We only found out the truth because the police got involved. They'd been getting reports about missing pets, and they connected the dots to what was happening at our school. One night, they hid near the field to catch whoever was doing this. It's scary to think about how long this went on before anyone figured it out. We were walking around on that field for games and gym class, never knowing what had happened there the night before. Story 26. In my hometown of Dorking, in the UK, we had this super cool local legend about a ghost squirrel. Everyone called him Albie, and he was famous around town. But here's the thing, Albie wasn't your average squirrel ghost story. People only ever saw Albie in one place, the graveyard at our local church. Now, if that doesn't sound spooky, I don't know what does. Kids would dare each other to go into the graveyard at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly white squirrel. For the longest time, Albie was this big mystery. Some folks swore they saw him darting between gravestones or scurrying up trees. Others thought it was just a crazy story made up to scare tourists or little kids. But then we found out the truth about Albie. And let me tell you, it was way cooler than we expected. Turns out, Albie wasn't a ghost at all. He was a real, live albino squirrel. That's why he looked all Albie
white
had
and
made his home in one of the big
especially
old
in the dim
trees
light
right
of the
there in the
graveyard.
church grounds. It was pretty awesome to know that our town's spooky legend was actually true, just not in the way we thought. Instead of a supernatural squirrel spirit, we had this rare, beautiful albino squirrel living right in the heart of our town. Sadly, this story doesn't have the happiest ending. A couple of years ago, poor Albie had an accident. He ended up as roadkill, which is a bummer way for such a cool local celebrity to go. Story 27. This all went down back in the 1970s. My aunt and uncle were these wild artist types living in Manhattan. They had this big German shepherd dog, and sadly, it died. Now, in New York City, getting the city to come take away a dead pet costs a ton of money. But they found out it was way cheaper to take the dog up to the animal control office in the Bronx themselves. So, what did they do? They stuffed their poor dead dog into a suitcase. I know it sounds nuts, but that's just how my aunt and uncle rolled. This wasn't some little lap dog either. We're talking about a 50-pound German shepherd all folded up in there. They start heading for the subway with this super heavy suitcase. But here's where things get wild. They're waiting to cross the street, and my uncle puts down the suitcase for a second because, man, that thing was heavy. Suddenly, these kids come running by and snatch the suitcase. My uncle tries to chase after them, but let's just say he wasn't exactly in top shape. Picture an overweight guy who likes his booze a bit too much trying to run through New York in the middle of summer. Yeah, those kids got away easy. For years after that, my aunt and uncle would crack up imagining what those kids said when they opened up that suitcase. I mean, can you picture it? They probably thought they scored some fancy clothes or maybe some cash. Instead, they got a big surprise they definitely weren't expecting. Story 28. In the forests of Washington State, there was this story going around about a fairy house hidden somewhere in the woods. You know how these local legends are. Most people thought it was just made up to entertain kids or scare campers. But one day, a park ranger decided to see if there was any truth to this tale. He went out into the woods, not really expecting to find anything. But guess what? He actually found something. Deep in the forest, there it was. A real treehouse. It wasn't some magical fairy home, of course. But finding any kind of building out there in the middle of nowhere was pretty weird. The ranger, being curious, decided to take a look inside. But what he found wasn't magical or fun at all. It was super disturbing. The treehouse was full of really bad stuff, pictures that hurt kids. The ranger knew right away this was serious trouble. He did the right thing and took down the treehouse, reporting what he found to the police. But the story doesn't end there. A while later, he went back to check, and someone had built the treehouse again in the same spot. This time, the police got really involved. They kept watch and eventually caught the person who was using the treehouse for these awful things. They arrested him and made sure he couldn't hurt any more kids. Story 29. You know Freddy Krueger, the scary guy from those movies who kills people in their dreams? Well, get this. His story might be based on something that really happened. It's pretty wild. There's this group of people called the Hmong. They're from Southeast Asia and have had a really tough time. During the Vietnam War, they helped the US, but when the war ended badly, they were in big trouble. So the US flew a bunch of Hmong families to safety in America, mostly to California and Minnesota. Now, here's where it gets creepy. One young Hmong guy, who seemed totally healthy, suddenly died in his sleep. Nobody knew why. They think maybe it was a heart attack, but they're not sure. This really freaked out the Hmong community. See, they have this old legend about an evil spirit that can get into your dreams and kill you. Sound familiar? Yep, just like Freddy Krueger. These Hmong people were already scared and stressed from moving to a new country. Now they were terrified of this dream monster too. Plus, they didn't have access to their usual traditions that they believed protected them from evil spirits. Young Hmong men started doing everything they could to stay awake. They drank tons of coffee and energy drinks. They were so scared of falling asleep that it actually started hurting their hearts. Sadly, more and more of these young men started dying in their sleep. By the end, 117 men had died from what people called Hmong sleeping sickness. It wasn't really a sickness, it was fear and stress causing heart problems. This real-life nightmare is probably what inspired the Freddy Krueger stories. It's a sad reminder that sometimes being too afraid of something can be more dangerous than the thing itself. Story 30. So, there's this lake near where I live, and for years, people have been talking about these huge monsters living by the hydroelectric dam. You know how these stories go. Most folks just rolled their eyes and figured it was just fishermen making up tall tales. We all thought it was just another version of the big one that got away story. But guess what? This legend turned out to be true, and the real story is even cooler than the made-up one. Here's what happened. After a bunch of heavy rain and flooding, some divers had to go check out the dam to make sure it wasn't damaged. One of these divers was swimming around, doing his job, when he saw what he thought was this big, mossy boulder. No big deal, right? Wrong. When he got closer, that boulder suddenly moved. It even tried to grab onto the diver's arm. Can you imagine how freaked out that guy must have been? Turns out, these weren't lake monsters at all. They were catfish. But not just any catfish. We're talking about fish that weigh around 200 pounds. That's as heavy as a grown man. So how did these fish get so huge? Well, it's pretty clever actually. These catfish hang out right behind the dam where all the dead fish that go through the hydroelectric turbines end up. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for them. Plus, the water there is all churned up from the dam, which actually makes it easier for these big fish to breathe. And here's the kicker. Nobody's allowed to fish within 1,000 meters of the dam. So these catfish have their own private sanctuary where they can grow as big as they want. Story 31. So there's this road called Whippoorwill that's got a pretty spooky reputation. People say it's either haunted or that it's where some really creepy groups like the KKK or other weird cults hang out. You can even find articles about it online, so it's kind of famous for being creepy. One night, me and two of my friends decided to check it out. We were feeling brave, or maybe just stupid. You know how it is when you're young and looking for thrills. We're driving down this road, and let me tell you, it's not your average street. It's a narrow dirt road with thick trees on both sides, the kind of place that feels spooky even in daylight. But we were there at night, which made it 10 times creepier. Suddenly, out of nowhere, this big white Bronco, that's a type of car, shows up behind us. This thing had these huge LED lights that were so bright, it was like daylight in our rearview mirror. But they weren't just driving behind us, they were trying to run us off the road. This Bronco was right on our tail, forcing us to speed up. Remember, this is a narrow, twisty dirt road we're talking about. It was terrifying. We came to this big hill about a mile long, the kind of hill you should take slow. But with this crazy driver behind us, we had to go fast. When we got to the top of the hill and started going down the other side, something weird happened. The Bronco just disappeared. It stayed behind at the top of the hill and vanished like it was never there. The whole thing was intense, like something out of a horror movie. We figure maybe they were patrolling the area, keeping watch for some secret cult or clan meeting. Who knows? Story 32. In Anchorage, Alaska, there's this story that people often tell. It's about a woman who died in a really weird and scary way by getting stuck in mud that was only knee-deep. This happened in a place called Turnagain Arm. Now, when most people hear this story, they think it's just made up. You know, one of those urban legends that get passed around but aren't really true. The story has all these dramatic details that make it sound like something from a movie. They say the woman was just married, and that there were people all around trying to save her but couldn't. It's the kind of tale that makes you go, no way, that can't be real. I mean, how could someone die in mud that's not even that deep, right? But here's the shocking part. This actually happened. It's not just a story. It's real. The woman's name was Adriana Dickinson. She wasn't just some nameless person in a spooky tale. She was a real person with a real life. Story 33. You know how sometimes people do silly things to show off? Well, this story is about a guy who took his joke way too far, with really sad results. In Toronto, Canada, there was this lawyer who worked in a big office building way up on the 24th floor. He had this weird way of trying to be funny. He'd tell everyone that the windows in the building were super strong, so strong you couldn't break them. Then, to prove his point, he'd run at the window and slam into it. Now, most people would think this is a crazy thing to do, right? But he'd done it so many times that I guess he thought it was safe. One day, though, something went terribly wrong. He did his usual run and slam trick, but this time, instead of just bouncing off the glass, the whole window popped right out of its frame. And just like that, he fell out of the building all the way down from the 24th floor. It's awful to think about, but he didn't survive the fall. Story 34. In my small hometown, there was this wild rumor going around. Kids would whisper about how all the grown-ups in charge, like teachers, cops, and business owners, were having these big secret parties. Of course, as you got older, you'd think, no way, that's just silly kid stuff. But then something crazy happened that made everyone wonder if the rumor was true after all. One day, out of the blue, a teacher's husband started beating up a local store owner. Right there on the street, in broad daylight. Everyone was shocked. Why would he do that? Well, it turns out the old rumor wasn't just make-believe. There really was a secret group in town, and they called themselves the Hot Tub Club. A bunch of important people in town were part of it, including the teacher whose husband got so angry. See, these adults were having private parties that, well, let's just say they weren't the kind of parties you'd invite kids to. The teacher's husband found out his wife was going to these parties, but he wasn't invited. That's why he got so mad and attacked the store owner. After this fight, the secret came out. A lot of people who were seen as leaders in the town were part of this club. They'd been having these grown-up parties for a long time without anyone knowing. The weirdest part? In a small town where everyone usually knows everyone else's business, they managed to keep this a secret for years. It just goes to show, sometimes the craziest rumors can turn out to be true. Story 35. In my hometown, we had two wild stories that turned out to be true. One was creepy, and the other, well, it was downright scary. First, there were these rumors about secret tunnels under our town. See, a big chunk of our town used to be this huge mental hospital, like its own little city. Everyone talked about these tunnels, but it was always, I heard about them, and never, I've been in them. Well, me and my friends decided to play explorer. We were poking around in the woods when we found this old, beaten-up maintenance shack. It had a basement, but it was full of water. Bummer, right? A couple years later, we had this terrible drought. Everything dried up, including that flooded basement. So we went back, and guess what? There was this rusty old door in the basement, and yep, it led right into those tunnels everyone talked about. Now, I'd love to tell you we found escaped patients or ghosts or something, but nah, it was just some old empty tunnels. Still pretty cool though. But here's where things get really freaky. In our town, there was this old guy everyone knew. He had this white van, and he'd park it, open up the back, and play the spoons. I mean, he was crazy good at it. He'd play along with whatever was on the radio. Us middle school kids, we thought it was hilarious to joke that he might be a bad guy, you know? But then the jokes kind of stopped, and nobody really talked about it anymore. Fast forward to a year after I finished high school. Spoon Man was still around, still playing his spoons. But then, out of nowhere, he got arrested. Turns out, he really had hurt a kid. Story 36. You know how sometimes really scary things can happen right under your nose? Well, this story is about exactly that kind of situation. In our neighborhood, there was this family living on the same property as us. They had two brothers. One day, the younger brother just disappeared. Poof, gone without a trace. Now, in a small town like ours, news like this spreads fast. Everyone was talking about it, trying to figure out what happened. Some people started whispering that maybe the older brother had something to do with it. But when the police got involved, they said no way. They were sure the little brother had been kidnapped by a stranger. For about a week, this was the biggest story in town. Everyone was worried sick about the missing kid. People were locking their doors, watching their own kids extra close, and hoping the police would find him soon. But then something happened that shocked everyone. The truth came out, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. It turned out those whispers about the older brother were right. He had done something terrible. He had actually killed his little brother. And here's the really creepy part. He buried the body right in our backyard. Can you imagine? This awful thing had happened so close to where we lived, where we played, where we felt safe. It was like finding out there had been a monster living next door all along. This whole scary situation taught us some hard lessons. First, sometimes the truth can be even worse than the rumors. Second, you never really know what's going on in other people's lives, even if they live right next to you. It also showed us why it's so important to speak up if you see or hear something that doesn't seem right. Maybe if someone had paid more attention to the brothers or noticed something off, things could have turned out differently. Story 37. So there was this crazy story going around Tampa that I kept hearing from friends. They'd talk about this weird guy they called the shoe licker. Now, that's a pretty strange nickname, right? According to the stories, this guy would come up to people in public places and start asking about their shoes. Then, he'd ask to see the bottom of their shoes. Here's where it gets really weird. He'd try to lick the bottom of their shoes before they could put their foot back down. Now, when I heard this, I thought, no way, that's just too bizarre to be true. I figured it was just one of those made-up stories that people pass around for fun. But then, it happened to me. And let me tell you, it was just as weird as the stories said. I was at this taco truck waiting for my food. By the way, that taco turned out to be the best I've ever had in my life. I had just finished performing somewhere, so I was still wearing my Doc Marten boots. And I'll admit, I'd had a few drinks, so I wasn't totally with it. This skinny guy with long hair walks up to me. He looked like he might be homeless. He could have been anywhere from 18 to 30 years old. It was hard to tell. He starts asking me about my boots. I'm confused, but I figure, why not? And show him the bottom of my boot. That's when things got crazy. This guy drops to the ground, grabs my boot, and starts licking the bottom of it. I yelled at him and kind of kicked it to get him off. He ran away pretty quick after that. It was the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. I couldn't believe that the crazy story I'd heard so many times actually turned out to be true. Story 38. When I was 15, I had a job at a local store. There was this older couple who'd come in sometimes, and they always caught everyone's attention. It was clear that they had some problems with how their minds worked. They seemed different from most people. Now, in small towns, people talk. There was a rumor going around about this couple. People were saying that they were actually brother and sister, not husband and wife. And the really shocking part? The two teenage girls always with them were supposedly their kids. At the time, I thought it was just another crazy rumor. You know how people can be, making up wild stories about folks who are different. But about 5 years later, I found out something that gave me chills. Someone had called the state authorities about this family, and it turns out the rumor was mostly true. From what I heard, the older couple were indeed brother and sister. Their own parents had been related, which is why they had some mental difficulties, and sadly, they had kids together, too, those teenage girls. The state stepped in to help. They took the daughters away and put them in state care, because the parents couldn't take care of them properly. I'm not sure what happened to the parents after that. This whole situation was really sad and scary. It showed me that sometimes the stories you hear that sound too weird to be true can actually be real. It also made me realize how important it is for people to speak up when they think someone might be in trouble, especially kids. Story 39. In Toronto, Canada, There's an area called The Village where lots of gay people live and hang out. For years, something really scary was happening there. Gay men were disappearing. The people who lived in the village were really worried. They thought there might be a serial killer targeting gay men. That's someone who kills multiple people over time. It's a terrifying thing to think about in your own neighborhood. But when the community went to the police with their fears, the police said no. They told everyone not to worry, that these disappearances weren't connected. They said there wasn't a serial killer. Well, it turns out the community was right and the police were wrong. And the truth was even scarier than people imagined. There really was a serial killer. This guy worked as a gardener and landscaper, taking care of people's yards. He was killing gay men, cutting up their bodies and burying them in the gardens and properties where he worked. This went on for years before he was finally caught. It's really upsetting to think about how many lives were lost because the police didn't believe the community's concerns at first. Story 40. In my hometown, there was this weird story that everyone knew about. People talked about a guy who would get really friendly with trees. Some folks called him Mr. Woodcock, but most people just called him the tree shagger. Shagger is a British slang word for someone who, well, you know. Now, I thought this was just one of those crazy stories people make up. I mean, come on, a guy who does that with trees? No way that could be real, right? Well, one night, I found out just how wrong I was. My friend and I were out walking his dog. We were on this narrow lane with trees on both sides. It was pretty dark and quiet. Then we heard this weird grunting noise coming from the bushes. We looked over, and there he was, the tree shagger himself. He had on this long coat that was wrapped around a tree. His pants were down around his ankles. And he was. Well, let's just say he was being way too friendly with that poor tree. I couldn't believe my eyes. This guy was actually doing what the rumor said, right there in front of us. He didn't seem to care about who might see him or about getting splinters in some really uncomfortable places. It was one of the weirdest, grossest things I've ever seen. We got out of there pretty quick, I can tell you that. Story 41. In our town, there's this really interesting story about a mysterious guy who showed up out of nowhere one night. He was about 40 years old, but here's the weird part. He couldn't speak a single word in any language. Can you imagine not being able to talk to anyone at all? Luckily, there was this kind man in town who decided to help him out. He gave the mystery guy a place to stay, food to eat, and even started teaching him how to talk a little bit. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, learning to speak for the first time as a grown-up. As time went on, this guy became a big part of our town. He worked all over the place, at gas stations, mechanic shops, regular stores, you name it. It's like he was trying to learn everything he could about how our town worked. But the coolest part was what he did in his free time. He'd just walk around town, popping into different stores to say hi to people. He even had this funny habit of checking the tires on the police cars to make sure they were okay. It's like he appointed himself as the unofficial town helper. Everyone in town really liked him. He might not have been able to talk much, but he found his own way to be friendly and useful. It's pretty amazing how he went from being a total stranger who couldn't communicate at all to becoming someone everyone knew and cared about. Sadly, this story doesn't have a happy ending. The mystery man passed away recently. But even though he's gone, people in town still talk about him. His story reminds us that you don't always need words to be kind or to become part of a community. Story 42. In Mombasa, Kenya, there was this spooky story that everyone knew. People talked about a mysterious woman who would show up on the beach at night. They said she had long black hair and wore a white dress. Sounds pretty creepy, right? This story wasn't just for fun, it had a purpose. Grown-ups used it to scare kids and adults alike from going to the beach at night for a swim. After all, who'd want to bump into a ghost lady while taking a moonlight dip? For a long time, people really believed this ghost story. Some swore they'd seen her themselves. But guess what? The truth turned out to be way different. And kind of funny. There really was a woman walking on the beach at night in a white outfit. But she wasn't a ghost at all. She was just an older lady from the town who had a weird habit. She was a sleepwalker. This poor woman had no idea she was causing such a fuss. Every night she'd fall asleep in her nightgown, which looked like a white dress in the dark. Then, without waking up, she'd walk all the way to the beach and wander around. Everyone calls for a long time. Everyone was too scared to find out the truth.
Oh, he probably
But
just
finally,
really
some
likes
brave
cats, right?
locals decided
But
to
nope,
solve the mystery.
It's way more interesting
One
than
night,
that.
when they saw
This
the
guy
ghost,
doesn't just
they
follow
followed
cats.
And where
He
did
lives
she
like
go?
one.
Right back
He
to her
dresses
house
up
in
in
a
a
full
full
cat costume.
When they told the
complete with
lady
a
what was
tail and
happening,
whiskers, she was super
and get
surprised.
this, he doesn't just
she had
do it
no
for special
clue
occasions
she'd
or
been taking
events.
nightly beach
He
walks
does it
in her
all
sleep,
the time.
just going about his normal life as if being a human-sized cat is the most natural thing in the world. Now, for those of us who've lived here a while, Catman is just part of our everyday life. We're used to seeing him around town, doing regular stuff like shopping or walking down the street. It's like, oh, there's Catman buying milk, must be Tuesday. But for newcomers to our town, let's just say it can be quite a shock. Take my uncle's new wife, for example. She moved here from out of town after marrying my uncle. When we told her about Catman, she thought we were just messing with her. You know how sometimes locals like to play jokes on newcomers with tall tales about their town? She figured this was one of those. Well, she found out pretty quick that we weren't kidding. About a week after she moved here, she was doing her grocery shopping at the local store. And who should walk in but Catman himself, in full cat mode, just casually picking out his groceries like any other shopper. You can imagine her surprise. There she was, standing in the cereal aisle, and suddenly a man-sized cat strolls by with a shopping cart. It was quite a welcome to our quirky little town for her. Story 44. So, you know how every school has those wild rumors about secret rooms and hidden places? Well, at my old school, some of those rumors were actually true. First off, we had this creepy shelter in the basement. They built it back in the 1950s when everyone was worried about nuclear war. It was like a mini school underground, with classrooms and desks that had never been used. Super spooky, right? Getting to this shelter wasn't easy. You could only get in from the basement, from under the auditorium stage, or through a tiny hole in the principal's office. All the outside entrances had been sealed up long ago. It was like something out of a mystery novel. But wait, it gets even crazier. Our school really did have a secret pool. For years, kids would whisper about how a girl drowned herself there. Turns out that part was just a myth. But something bad did happen in that pool. The real story? A guy actually did drown there. And it wasn't just an accident. He was high on cocaine he'd stolen from his dad, who was the gym coach at the time. Pretty intense stuff. After that happened, an inspector came to check out the pool. Guess what they found out? The school wasn't even allowed to have built the pool in the first place. Talk about a major oops. So what did the school do? They decided to get rid of the pool in the weirdest way possible. They drained all the water, then filled it up with all sorts of junk, dirt, bricks, old tires, trash, you name it. Then they covered the whole thing in cement. Now, you'd never know there was once a pool there except for two things. There's an old picture hanging in the main office that shows the pool. And if you go down to the basement, you can see this odd rectangular shape in the cement floor. That's all that's left of our school's secret pool. Story 45. Have you ever heard of Charlie No Face? If you grew up near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you probably have. It's a spooky story that kids in that area love to tell each other. The legend goes that Charlie was a guy who worked for the electric company. Something terrible happened to him, maybe an accident with acid or an electric power line. The stories say it melted his face off, and some even claim it turned his skin green. According to the tales, Charlie wanders around creepy places at night. One spot he's said to haunt is an old abandoned train tunnel in South Park Township. People call it the Green Man Tunnel because of the story. For years, teenagers have driven into this tunnel hoping to see Charlie. Some say they felt weird electrical charges when he's around. Others claim their cars won't start after they call out his name. A few even say they've seen his glowing ghost in the tunnel or on dark country roads. Here's the wild part. This story isn't completely made up. There's actually some truth behind it. The real Charlie No Face wasn't named Charlie at all. His name was Raymond Robinson. In 1919, when Raymond was just a kid, he and his friends were playing on an electrified trolley bridge. Raymond got badly electrocuted. The accident burned off his nose, hurt one of his arms, and damaged both his eyes. But he survived. After that, Raymond lived a pretty quiet life. He didn't like to go out during the day because of how he looked. Instead, he'd take walks at night when fewer people were around. But here's a nice twist. Even though he looked different, Raymond was actually a friendly guy. If people stopped to talk to him during his night walks, he'd chat with them. So while the spooky story about Charlie No Face isn't exactly true, it was inspired by a real person who had a really tough life. Raymond's story reminds us that sometimes people who look different on the outside can be kind and friendly on the inside. Story 46. You know how grandparents sometimes have weird sayings to get kids to behave? Well, my grandmother had a really creepy one. She used to tell me, if you're bad, the sleeping strangler will get you. Pretty scary, right? But I always thought it was just something she made up. Turns out, there's a really freaky true story behind her warning. Back in the mid-1800s in Boston, where my grandmother's family lived, there was this terrifying serial killer. People called him the Boston Sleeper. Now, this is some seriously scary stuff, so brace yourself. This killer would sneak into homes and take Irish children right out of their beds while they were sleeping. The kids would be missing for months, sometimes even a year. Then, in a really creepy twist, they'd show up dead in someone else's bed. The child who was supposed to be in that bed would then go missing. It's hard to believe, but the Boston police didn't even try to solve these crimes. Even worse, some newspapers actually wrote about these horrible events like they were a good thing. They called it a welcome cleansing of the swine, which is a really mean way of talking about Irish people. If you liked these stories, please like and subscribe, and share any of your personal stories in the comments below. And if you have the time, watch one of the videos that are on your screen now. Thank you.